welcome to Wind Down Wednesdays. I'm your host, Paula Taylor, and this is episode 196, take 2. So today we are going to talk about reawakening your magic, and this is kind of a funny story just about the episode itself. First of all, I'm going to say that I'm not at home. I'm in Santa Barbara in an Airbnb. I have my friend, the dog next door, who barks on and off all day and all night. And I've got the windows closed, so hopefully that won't come through. I'm also sitting on a kind of a crickety stool, so I'm just going to apologize in advance for any extraneous sounds. I've done my best to kind of keep things focused audioly. I don't think that's a word, but in the sound realm, there may be some extra sounds, and it's just kind of is what it is. So I have a funny story about this episode before we even get into talking about reawakening your magic. I recorded this entire episode before I left Tucson, and it was about an hour and 6 minutes long for the Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary. They get the last 20 minutes or so that includes the activation. If that calls you, we'd love to have you join us there. And I told 2 stories, and I was using this external mic that I've been using for a while, but it wasn't recording sound. After 30 minutes, it died. And I would have assumed that my phone mic would have just taken over as I was live streaming this to Facebook, because I live stream it into the private Facebook group for the Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary. Then I download that video, then I edit the audio, and then I upload it to the podcast. And what happened was it just cut off. So there was 30 minutes of me talking and telling this story, and then another 40 minutes of me talking to apparently just myself. And what's really interesting, and this has happened so many times, I know it's not a coincidence. Yesterday I had a big insight that directly applies to this topic and how I talk about this topic. So the first story that I told in that episode was now going to be a bonus content for this episode that will only be available to the Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary. It was pretty emotional story I told about my dad. But today we're going to focus on something a little bit different. And I just want to say briefly, ever since I was getting ready to come out here, and including the drive out here to Santa Barbara, I've been seeing repeating numbers, ridiculous amounts. I set my alarm for 6 o'clock the day I left. I woke up at 5:55. I got in my car. It was 77 degrees in Tucson, which it hasn't been that cool for a long time. I was driving through Phoenix. It was 88 degrees. I was looking at the highway signs because I needed to stop and get gas. And Quartzsite, which is the last town before you cross into California that's in Arizona, it was 66 miles. Then it was 33 miles. Then it was 22 miles. I mean, it's ridiculous how many repeating numbers I've been seeing. So as I was getting ready to do this episode, I looked down at my phone and it was 11:11 and my battery was at 88%. So there's a lot of synchronicities happening right now, and the energy is really intense, and it's kind of doing this back and forth thing. So if you're listening to this around when it comes out, just know that you're being supported, even if it doesn't feel like it, including when you've recorded an entire episode of your podcast and you were all proud of yourself because you did it with way more than enough time to get it ready before you left town, and then half of it didn't record because there's something grander happening. This happens to me a lot, and I talk about it on the show, where I think I'm going to do a show and then I receive these kind of last minute downloads, or something else happens that gives me a little bit of a different perspective. And that's actually what happened to me yesterday with this topic. So today we're talking about reawakening your magic, and I'm going to talk a little bit and then give you kind of a involved story about this. And since I recorded this last week, I could tell you so many more stories about this, and they'll probably be in future episodes. And I want to keep this digestible because sometimes I get really excited and I could just talk for hours. So this is one of those topics. And so I'm going to leave it there. So what I was talking about, it's also funny because I recorded this before. So part of me is what did I say? And do I need to say the same things? And where is this going? So we're just in flow, and we're going to see where this goes. But one of the things that I was talking about, and this is where I had a little bit of an aha that we'll get back to, was this idea of reawakening your magic as part of your spiritual awakening journey. And I think a lot of us as children had these magical connections, whether it was a connection with our imagination, which now I realize, like, a lot of times if we had an imaginary friend, that was probably really one of your spirit guides, seeing things that adults didn't see, hearing things that adults didn't hear. And at some point along the way, especially if we have trauma, and I think all of us have a history of some trauma, culturally, if not developmentally and like intergenerationally and all the other ways that we can have trauma neurodivergently, some point along the way, we shut our magic down. We lose contact with our magic. And I had this experience on my dad's birthday that brought this into my conscious mind. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but essentially, the song Puff the Magic Dragon came into my brain. And I remembered that the story of this song is essentially about a little boy who has a magical dragon that he visits. And as he grows up, he loses contact with the dragon. And not only does it affect him, it affects the dragon. And I realized, like, in the context of when this came up, that this is a beautiful allegory for what happens to us. We are born with this really innate, beautiful spiritual magic, and it's programmed out of us culturally as we grow up so that we can be good worker bees and do the things we're supposed to do. And part of the journey of spiritual awakening is reawakening that magic. And what I had said in the other version of this that I recorded was that this tends to happen as we're moving out of the integration or healing space, out of the trauma healing space, and more into the awakening space. And we're always kind of going back and forth. But I feel like there's a point on this journey at which you're in more of the awakening space than you are in the integration space. And I had this insight yesterday that explained, or that helped me understand where this point is, what happens along this point. But I'm going to keep that as a little bit of a cliffhanger while I tell you my story, and then we'll come back to that. Where is the point at which you can start to reawaken your magic? How do you know you're in this place in the journey when you've done enough of the trauma healing work that you can be in this expansive space of reawakening your magic? And I actually have an answer for that now that I didn't really have so clearly when I recorded this last week. So there's a little bit of magic right there. So I'm going to tell you a story about how I was working with this Epstein-Barr virus, this chronic Epstein-Barr virus that I've been trying to clear. And I've talked about this on a couple of other episodes. I talked about it, I think, in depth on What's the Deal with Energetic Vampires. I talked about it, I think, a little bit on What's the Deal with Trickster Energy. So I've been working with this EBV, this Epstein-Barr virus. I'm going to use EBV as a lot faster for like at least a year now, trying to kind of clear this out. I had mono when I was 19, and I've had chronic fatigue ever since then. Like, it's one of those things where I sort of recovered from the acute illness, but it never got fully better. I'm getting slow connection warnings from the Wi-Fi here, so hopefully this is recording because I don't have to do a third time's a charm on this episode. So I've been working with this, and I had an experience a couple weeks ago that really illustrated kind of this idea of reawakening your magic, and how we move from a space of trauma healing into a space of magic. And this all happened over the course of one bodywork session I was receiving. And I will say, again, I've been doing this work for at least a year now. I think this started before I went to Bali, which was spring of last year. So a year and a half, I've been really focused on this. So sometimes I think when we receive things or we hear people say, I did the thing in one session, like, it wasn't really one session. I was shown the release of this in one session, but there was a year and a half of work leading up to that session. And I think that's important to understand. So I went into this session kind of knowing that I wanted to clear this EBV, especially this was right before I left Tucson for this mini residence in California. And it was very funny because I was talking to the practitioner before we started, and I said, I feel like there's just a little kernel of this left, and we've really been doing this work, and we just need to like release the little kernel. And then when I got into the session, I realized that was like my mind's way of protecting me from realizing how big this really was going to be. So I got on the table, and it was a very interesting experience. And we talked about this afterwards because it was like there were two totally separate sessions going on. The practitioner was doing work on me that absolutely was like holding the space of what I was doing and working on my body in a way that was supportive. And I was in my own session and my own experience releasing this really dense trickster energy that is EBV. And I use the term trickster because Epstein-Barr there's a lot of viruses like this, and Epstein-Barr is one that is a very good example of how cagey, how sneaky, how insidious these viruses can be, because you get infected with whatever it is, mono, a lot of times it starts out as, and then the virus goes dormant in your system and it kind of hides. And so you start to think you're okay. And then every time you start to think you're okay, it sort of shows up in all these different ways. And the most recent thing that happened to me, you might remember me talking about having this weird flare up of eczema in my hands that I'd never had before. This often happens when we're getting ready to really clear something that's really deep, whether it's emotional, energetic, and physical. It's usually all three, especially something that we've been carrying for a really long time. It gets worse before it gets better, because it wants to scare you into submission. It wants you to stop going down that path of fully releasing the trauma or the emotional, the energetic space that's been allowing it to persist. Because some people get these kind of viruses like EBV and they clear them right away. They have the acute, they clear it, they never have it again, or it goes dormant and it never shows up again. So I think the difference when it becomes like a chronic thing is that always underlying that there is some sort of like childhood trauma, developmental trauma, cultural trauma. There is some sort of energetic, sometimes it's past life, quantum life, origin trauma. And the more serious, the more chronic something is, what I've seen with my clients as well is that the more layers it exists on, the harder it is to get rid of and the more chronic it tends to be. So a lot of times there's like multiple things. And I've talked about clearing some ancestral energy that was very trickstery, and like all of the things that sort of led up to this space of what I now hope is like full release. So I got on the table, and pretty quickly I realized it wasn't just like a small kernel that was, and this has been focused, I've known for a while, like in my thymus gland area, which is behind my breastbone. So if you're in the spiritual awakening sanctuary and you see me keep pointing to my chest or even kind of thymus rubbing, that's hopefully that's not making a lot of noise with the mic. I'll try to stop doing that. So pretty quickly it became apparent that this wasn't just a little kernel in my chest area. It was, the visual I got was a giant spider that was like kind of, the body was focused at my chest or my heart space, and these huge arms were coming out of my back and just wrapping around my entire body. And all of a sudden I realized again, like how large this was. They were going into my brain. It was like my entire being was occupied by this energy, by this virus and I was seeing it in the form of this spidery energy. And I was kind of disappointed because first of all, I wanted to just receive in this session, and I felt like there was some magic in the air, and I really wanted to experience this magic, and I wanted it to be fun and blissful and joyful. And it was like, oh, this is going to be like heavy work. But I was like, this is what I'm here for. This is what we're doing. So I just started working with pulling these like tentacles, these like yucky spider legs of this energy out of my space, out of my body, out of my brain. And this was a very delicate process. It's not something where you can just like pry it off because it's been in there for so long. It's really, I think there were a lot of parts of my system that thought the virus was just how we were made. It didn't realize that it was like an invader essentially. So this was very tedious, and it was very heavy, and it was very intense energetic work where she was sort of holding the space and I was working with my guides, with my archangels, especially to like pull these things out of my body. And so that went on for like a good part of the session, this just like tedious work of like pulling out these things and sort of trying to gently pry it off of it felt like it was like attached to my back. And throughout I was kind of like, I wanted a magical experience. And it's interesting, it doesn't get much more magical than releasing a really long-standing disease. And sometimes we have to understand what our perspective, like from my perspective in that moment, I wanted fun magic. I wanted joy magic. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, reawakening, like fun and joyful magic. But this heavy work is also magic, because if you can clear something that's been in your system for 30 years, that's pretty magical, especially when you haven't been able to receive help in more traditional ways. And it doesn't usually happen overnight. And I think, again, that's important to remember. So I was pulling this big, huge, spidery, gross energy out, and I could feel all the resistance. And it was such a delicate process of it just went on. It felt like for hours. And then finally it was like, I felt like I got that off. And I was like, oh, thank God. Okay, now we can move on to the fun part. And then there were all these little baby spiders. And I was finding all these little baby spiders around my body. And so then I was having to clear all of these little baby spiders out. And it was just really, again, very tedious work, very like heavy work, very difficult work. But I was like, I'm doing this. I am not backing down. And I just kept clearing all these little spiders out and getting those all out. And that went on for a while. And then finally, it was like there were eggs in especially in my like chest area, in the thymus region is where it was coming in. And the thymus plays a role in your immune system. It also coincidentally starts to kind of shut down in your late teens, which is when I had mono. So then it was like, oh gosh, there's another layer of this. So then I'm pulling all the eggs out and I'm trying to get everything out. And it was just like, again, I thought I was going to have like this fun, magical experience. And it ended up being just really kind of dark and heavy, but it was like, I'm in it and this is what I'm doing. And so I just kept pulling those out and pulling those out and pulling those out. And finally, I got to a point where it felt like I had gotten everything out, at least everything I could get out that day. It's very interesting. I'm still doing this clearing of this heart space while I'm in Santa Barbara. And I think it's still related. For a while, I was finding what I felt like were more of these, like, again, they're showing themselves to me as eggs. I think that's just to make it more digestible, because this virus has been so deeply lodged in my system that it's not a matter of just like one and done. It's like an ongoing process, again, that I've been in for about 1.5 years. So this is related to this big kind of heart clearing that I'm having in general here. So I got to the space where like all the spiders were gone, all the eggs were gone, at least what I could do that day. And then that's when the magic really woke up. And that's why I wanted to tell this story. So I was lying there, and all of a sudden I was aware of my fascia, or sometimes I also say fascia. It's interchangeable to me. And that's this web of connective tissue that runs through the entire body. It wraps around all of your muscles. It lines the organs. It lines the inside of your abdominal cavity. And essentially, we are now starting to see scientific support of this, but the fascia is essentially your physical light body. So I talk a lot about the quantum body, the light body, the auric field. That's energetic. This is the physical representation of that energetic light that holds light physically in your physical body. So I was lying on the table and I was seeing the fascia kind of like you would see it under a microscope, and you can go look it up. It's pretty cool. It just looks kind of like a webbing. And all of a sudden it lit up and it started to look like angel aura quartz. I had to go and look. I could see the picture of it on the crystal cards that I have. And so it's very funny because I couldn't remember the name of it. I knew it started with an A, and there was a lot of angelic energy in this. And so then I kind of laughed. Again, that felt magical. But I was like, oh, it's angel aura quartz. So instead of just kind of seeing this sort of like dull yellowy sort of webbing, all of a sudden it lit up like full white light crystal, almost like the celestial realm. And it had all of these beautiful rainbow colors in it, which is how I knew it was angel aura quartz. So it was this lit up, it was like my entire body was lit up, and I could feel all the fascia lit up. And then I could see the seraphim realm, which is my first differentiation from source, my quantum origin, my first quantum origin. And I realized it was the same material, that the light that I see in the seraphim realm that is so blindingly white, but when you look closer at it, it's billions of these like prismatic rainbow color lights that like from further away just look like white light, that all of that was within me, that's what my physical body was made of. and I started crying, and my practitioner, was sort of like asked me if I was okay. And I just sort of like silently gave a thumbs up because I was crying because it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful to feel the light that my physical body is made of. I spent so many years of my life hating my body, full on hating my body. I had an eating disorder for 30 plus years. I've had this EBV for like 30 years. Interesting. Probably that's related, although there's a lot of deeper story behind that I don't want to get into right now. But I had an adversarial relationship with my body for most of my life, even in later childhood. And so all of a sudden I could feel the light of my body, and I could see it as a reflection of this angelic light that I know is the source of my being. And it was so beautiful that it was making me cry. I still can't really put into words like how beautiful it was and how lit up everything felt and how expanded I was in that moment. And the magic did not end there, because then all of a sudden I could see my DNA. And at the time it looked to me like harps. And I started kind of laughing because there's this sort of trope of harps in heaven, the angels going around playing these harps. And I realized the harps that they're playing in heaven is our DNA. And I realized that I've been doing this for a while without knowing exactly what I was doing, but I could see the DNA, and I could see the rungs of the DNA, kind of like strings of a harp. And I could see where there were issues in the DNA that needed to be fixed. Like the rung of the ladder didn't go all the way across, or it wasn't lit up quite right, or it was like dirty and it looked like it needed to be cleaned. So all of a sudden I started toning, and I knew exactly which rung of the DNA to play, like which string to pluck using my voice. And I started toning for my DNA, and I started going through, especially my glandular system, through the thyroid gland, through the thymus gland, got to the pancreas, had to hang out there for a while because it was really sluggish. And it was like, I can't explain how magical it was. First of all, to see my body in this beautiful glowing light that is, again, this angelic light, this light of source that physically exists within all of our bodies. It was like the EBV was hiding my own light from me. And that's a very trickstery thing to do, to convince you that you're not as bright as you think you are, that you're not as magical as you really are. And so when that had left my system, I could fully light up. And the next thing I knew, I was playing my DNA and shifting things in my DNA, and I could hear it and I could see it in my mind's eye. And it was so beautiful. It was so magical and so colorful, and just, again, I don't have words to describe how magical this experience was. And then I had a client the next day, and I went in and I could see her DNA too. And I realized that for a while now, when I can hear the tone that needs to be toned for the body, and I've just been doing that intuitively, but all of a sudden, it was actually looking more like a xylophone, where you play the bars of a xylophone. But I could hear from my client which tones needed to be made to adjust the DNA, the rungs on the DNA, to make one longer, to clean it up a little bit, to allow more communication. And it was such a magical experience, and it's such a good representation of this journey that starts with hard work. And that's where a lot of people get lost, because it's not easy. It's not spontaneous most of the time. We have spontaneous moments, but usually even the spontaneous moments are a result of previous work we've done. We don't necessarily like draw the connection there. There's no shortcut. There's no cheating this work of spiritual integration that leads to spiritual awakening. And the whole thing is about reawakening your magic and remembering that you came in as this really magical being, and reaccessing, reawakening the connection to that. I have such magical moments now on such a regular basis that I had a hard time narrowing them down enough to talk about this in one episode. In the bonus content for the Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary, I told the story of how this how this came to me and this like magical experience I had with my dad on my dad's birthday. And since I've been in Santa Barbara, there's been magic all around me in many moments. And then there's moments that are less magical. And I think that can be confusing and that can be discouraging. And I want to be very clear about that because I think sometimes when you follow someone like me as a spiritual content creator, whatever, that's a weird phrase for me, but I guess that's one of the hats that I wear. A lot of creators will tell you or will only show you the magic, the fun magic, the beautiful magic, the my entire body lit up and I could see my fascia as angel aura quartz and it was so beautiful it made me cry. And all of the magic leading up to that is just as important, if not more so, because the only reason I can reawaken that fun, blissful, joyful magic is because I've worked with the darker aspects of myself that is also still magic. Releasing a virus and seeing it as spiders so that your mind can understand what you're doing energetically, that's really magical. It's not fun magic. It's not necessarily joyful magic, but we have to do that excavation work. We have to do the integration work, the trauma work, the healing work, whatever word you want to use for that. All of that is magic, and it leads us back to reawakening that fun, joyful magic, that playfulness that we've lost. So here's the piece of this that I was missing until yesterday. I was sitting on the beach, just kind of being in space and sort of thinking about where I've been and what I've been doing. And I'd sat down and I had mapped out the 2 books that I want to write and had all these chapters sort of outlined of like what I was going to talk about in each book. And then I was just sort of sitting and being, and I realized that the ingredient here, the key ingredient here is nervous system healing. What shifts us out of that like trauma space and integration and healing and into the awakening and into the fun magic and into the joy and into the I'm a being of light and I can see all the prismatic light that I truly am, is having a nervous system that's healed enough to receive that without being overwhelmed. Even that deep work, it has taken me over a year and probably 30 years, train horn confirmation, to move enough energy through my system and let go of enough contraction and disharmony and muddiness in order to clear this EBV. And there's still pieces of it moving around. Like it's very funny as I'm talking, my voice is kind of, I'm having a hard time and I can kind of feel some things in my chest. And I know like the work is never done. And sometimes that feels discouraging. But when you start to get into this reawakening your magic, when your nervous system is healed enough to receive the fun and the joy and the play and the wonder, that is one of the things that helps us keep going. And as I was sitting on the beach yesterday, I was thinking about how calm I've been on this journey for the most part. I drove all the way here by myself through like really heavy traffic and I saw a really tragic accident. And I'm here completely by myself where I only know a single person and I've been really welcomed into this loving community. And all of that is something that like 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's no way I could have done that and been in a calm state. Someone even commented on one of my TikToks how calm and grounded I seem. And a lot of that, there's a lot of really magical energy here. But the only way I can access that is being calm enough and healed enough in my nervous system to receive. So when our nervous system is in a chronic triggered state, whether it's fight, flight, fawn, or functional freeze, this functional freeze allows you to function, but you have the sort of the attributes of freeze. A full freeze is a shutdown and we kind of stop functioning. But most of us are functioning in a triggered state, nervous system state, until we start doing the healing work around that. You cannot fully receive in that state because it doesn't feel safe to do so. If you don't feel safe, you cannot receive. And there's a lot of nuance around that. There's a lot of degrees of that. You can start to receive a little and a little more and a little more and a little more as you start to heal the nervous system. But until your nervous system reaches a point of healing where you really trust that you can access regulation yourself, most of us were not taught to regulate as children. We're supposed to co-regulate with our caregivers. They're supposed to know how to regulate themselves. Nobody taught them. This is how this trauma cycle goes. There's not really blame because it just goes from generation to generation to generation. So you're raised by caregivers who can't regulate themselves. And a lot of us actually were asked to regulate them, to be the regulation for our caregivers, which is not supposed to be your job as a child. That leads to the fawn response. When you are the person who's trying to help your caregiver regulate, you end up in a triggered nervous system response. And a lot of times it's a fawn response. Not always, but a lot of times. And so because we weren't taught to regulate and we weren't shown co-regulation, we grow up to be adults who still aren't regulated. And this cycle perpetuates. And it's the 5D word, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, if you're following my content, you are breaking that cycle. You are a generational curse breaker. And you are, at least to some extent, pursuing the healing of your own nervous system. And when we get to a certain point where we start to trust our ability to regulate ourselves, that is when we reawaken that magic. And you can actually, what we're going to do in the activation, I'm going to talk a little bit about this before I shift into Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary only, to show you the power of this work, because you might like to join us there. What we're going to do in the activation is we're going to see if we can find the point in childhood when the magic shut down. And there's nuance around that. It might not be it's not like it was on and then it was off. There's like a lot of times it's death by 1,000 tiny cuts or whatever. But when you look into this through a trauma lens, when you check into this with your intuition, there's usually like a moment that stands out. And you go, oh, this is the first memory I have of being really dysregulated, of feeling really unsafe. That is when the magic shut down. And the way to turn the magic back on, the way to reawaken the magic, is to start healing that nervous system response through inner child work, through learning how to regulate your own nervous system, through me helping you access your magical fascia light body and shifting the DNA that's telling you we've never been safe in all of the generations that we've physically been here. It's really important work and it's really powerful work. And if you would like to join us for that work, if you enjoy the show, if you want the bonus episodes, all the activations and the content that goes with that, interaction with like-hearted individuals, lots of exclusive discounts, we would love to have you join us in the Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary. It's $22 a month, and there is always a link in the show notes to learn more about that. We would love to have you there. Healing is magic. Nervous system regulation is magic. To be calm and centered, especially when things around you are really chaotic, that is magic. And you own that magic. That magic is yours. You've just got to remember how to get back to that space. Thank you so much for joining me today. Have a beautiful rest of your day or evening. I will see you on the next episode of Wind Down Wednesdays. No.